Good afternoon, everybody. I will start coming in and put myself front and center. Thank you all for joining me. Those of you joining me via Zoom and those of you on Facebook, because we're oversubscribed today. We've got a capacity for 100 on our Zoom account, and we've had well, it's about 110 sign up. I don't know if we'll get all of you on Zoom. It's on 70 at the moment, so we'll see if we have some who no shows. We've also doing it on Facebook Live, so if people weren't able to register on the main site, we've pointed them in the direction of Facebook, so we'll see how many people turn up there. Excuse me. My name's Don Brown. We'll start in a second or so. I think just a couple more people drifting in, so I'll give me a chance to have a sip of water. So I know we've got quite a few new faces. I know there's a few names I recognise who've done some of our tours, but a lot of new people. So I shall just give you a little bit of information about us and what we do. So let me first of all go into sharing the screen so that hopefully you can see the presentation. And let's get that up. So this is what we'll be looking at today. It's a virtual tour. Let me just alter a couple of things up here so it's not blocking the screen. So nice to see you all as well. It's good to see seeing some faces up there. And we'll be looking at the area around Parliament Square. The lockdown lights, or as my colleague called them, lunchtime lights. So I think we're on lockdown lunchtime lights. There are some new innovation for us. We have started off doing evening talks. So there are 5 of us in UK Tours Online. We are all London Blue Badge guides. That's reaching over for his thing, all London Blue Badge guides. Ordinarily, we would be walking around London, Bath, Stratford, Oxford, museums, galleries, pointing at things for visitors, whether those are visitors from the UK, whether they're big coach parties, whether they are individuals who have got time and money for a personal tour of Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's Cathedral. It is obviously not ordinarily at the moment. So for all of this year, we have full diaries of tours, books, March hits, bang, we've got empty diaries. And so we decided to move these online. So the 5 of us have got together doing these talks mainly in the evening, 5, 6, 7 o'clock, on different aspects of the sort of things that we would normally do. These tours last about an hour. Time for questions afterwards. They cost £10 each, and you can buy a season ticket. So you can pay for 4 and go to any 5. And we keep refreshing the list. So this is where we are at the moment. I think we've got a couple of added into December, and there'll be a few more on the run up to Christmas. And then we have an idea, or Rachel, one of us who does the Bath and Southwark talks, had the idea that a lot of people actually might not want to come something in the evening, but particularly with lockdown happening, would like a little bit of a break during the day. So we're all sort of confined to quarters for the next month. So hopefully some of these will give people just a little bit of a break, a little bit of history, a little bit of culture, a few photos, a few stories from some of the things that we do. And this is a list of what's coming up. Some of these are brand new. Some of them we've not done before. Some of them are shorter versions of some of the bigger tours that we do. And some of them, like this Parliament Square one, I do a virtual walk around Westminster, Whitehall, the Abbey, Buckingham Palace, St. James's Palace, that sort of thing. So it's part of that I've extended to look at Parliament Square, that sort of core area in the centre of London, where you have Parliament, the Abbey, and the Supreme Court, and statues of famous people. So we've got these coming up over the next couple of weeks. Again, we have season tickets for these so that you can book any four for, I think it's £20. So they're normally £6 each. So you can book any four for £20, and you can book all 8 of them for £35. So if you go to the website uktoursonline.com and book for whatever you like, and it would be nice to see some of you again on some of these. So let's kick off. So this is Parliament Square. This is central London, Houses of Parliament there in front of us. This is a photo from, I think it was an Oxfam campaign. One of the few sort of aerial shots that is copyright free, so I'm allowed to use it. There's Parliament Square in front of us, leading over the Westminster Bridge. You can see the London Eye. This is Whitehall down here. Around it, you have got various organs of the state and government, not just Parliament, but behind us we have the Supreme Court. This building here is the Treasury. This building here is Portcullis House, which is the Parliamentary Offices, one of the most expensive buildings ever built in London, and where these days quite a lot of the committee meetings happen. The square itself is relatively new. It was laid out in 1868. The architect Charles Barry, who we'll meet again when we talk about the design of the Houses of Parliament, and was done to help traffic move around. I mean, the story is always the same in London. People are always looking at ways of moving traffic. And in fact, the first traffic lights in the whole of the UK were on this corner here, and operated by a policeman to keep them going. So rather than having to put his hand up in the air, he could pull a lever and start things. But the site itself is an old one, and in fact it forms the crux of a place called Thorney Island. This is an illustration of how this might have looked in the early 1500s, the time of Henry VII, Henry VIII. You can see the Abbey in front of us here. This place is Westminster Hall, which we shall see shortly. But this is an area that was outside of London. So back then, London was the city of London, the square mile, the stuff to the east around St. Paul's. Thorney Island was a little sort of blip of land in between two branches of the River Tyburn that flow down from Hampstead, go under Buckingham Palace, goes through St. James's Park, splits here, and goes down into the Thames here. Back then, the Thames much wider, marshes on the far side of the river. This was the place where an abbey had grown up in probably the 900s, may have been a little bit before, and where a king called Edward the Confessor built a palace in the 1060s, and we'll come to that later on. So Parliament Square is sort of here in this map. So for a long time, it was a bit of high ground outside of London. It had a special sort of role all to itself, royal and religious. If we go and have a look at it now, or close to now, this is a sort of panorama shot. Again, Portcullis House here, and the Treasury over here. I'm going to try and click on this and see if I can bring up Google. I hope everyone can see this. So this is the, taking a little bit of time to load up. This is the Google Street View. Parliament Square bedecked in flags, so I suspect it was taken at a time when there was a Commonwealth conference, because these look like flags of the Commonwealth. Whitehall down here. We're in front of a church called St. Margaret's Church, which I'll come back to later, which is the parish church for the Palace of Westminster for MPs, and has its origins in the 12th century. We lead on round to Westminster Abbey over here, which we shall look at the end. But in front of us, we have got Parliament. At one end, the Victoria Tower, and at the other end, Big Ben. I can hear people bridling already that I've called that Big Ben. Its proper name is the Clock Tower, or the Elizabeth Tower, named the Elizabeth Tower in 2012 for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. Big Ben is the bell that strikes the hour, or doesn't strike the hour at the moment because they're still renovating it. But everyone calls the tower Big Ben. You know, it's become by use the name of the tower. If you say go to Big Ben, you don't mean people to go up and have a look at the bell. You mean to go to the clock tower. Just on that, we're not quite sure why the bell is called Big Ben. Lots of theories. It was one of the biggest bells cast. It was cast by the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, the same people who did the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, and installed, first rang in 1859. At that time, there was a pub close by, and the publican was someone called Ben Caunt, a famous prize fighter, and he'd been known as Big Ben. So one of the best stories is that the bell was named after the bloke who ran the pub. So I mean, it's good enough to keep us going, I think, on that. So I think it's an interesting one. There are other rumours for it. Most of the stuff we see here is, well, certainly in Parliament, is relatively new. The oldest bit is this in front of us. This is called Westminster Hall, and that dates to about 1100. So created by the son of William the Conqueror, who'd been crowned in Westminster Abbey in 1066, as a sort of moot hall, a meeting hall, and has survived for, well, 900 years, and still there in front of us. We'll come back to it a bit more in a second. Here's on the inside of it. These days, it is used, it's the entrance lobby when you go in to have a tour of Westminster Abbey. It's also used for meetings of both houses. So if there is a important speaker or even an important debate, that will be held here in Westminster Hall. I'm not sure which one this is, whether it's Obama's visit or President Xi of China's visit, but in recent years, Obama has spoken to meetings of both houses. The Pope did on his visit, and the Chinese president did. And again, if we zap into it on Google, we can see it is a huge space. When it was built, it was one of, if not the biggest enclosed space in the whole of Europe. And it has got this wonderful, it's called a hammer beam ceiling, made in oak, that covers the entire span. So again, in the early Middle Ages, this was the broadest span of any roof anywhere in Europe. It leads up here into what's called St. Stephen's Chapel, and in the earlier Parliament, there was actually a chapel there, and that's where some of the early parliaments met. That gives us the tradition of MPs bowing to the speaker when they come in and out, because in the past they would have been bowing to the altar as they came in and out. This became used for various different functions as well as meetings. So there were trials held here. William Wallace, Braveheart, was tried here. Guy Fawkes was tried here before his execution just outside in Westminster. Thomas More, tried here for standing up to Henry VIII, for refusing to accept that Henry was head of the church. And Charles I was also tried here. So in 1648, the trial of the king, put on trial for treason after losing the civil wars, later taken out and executed in Whitehall in front of Banqueting House. This is also the place where royals lie in state. So King George VI, the last king to lie in state here, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, also lay in state here. And if I zoom down here, you can see just by the tripod, This is where Winston Churchill lay in state in January 1965, before his funeral at St. Paul's Cathedral. It's an important part of British history, even though these days its uses for parliaments are much less. Go back onto here, and there are these wonderful little apple maps, give you little flyovers of the space. I'm going to do a flyover of Parliament before we talk about that. So the river frontier in front of the Thames. See the red and the green. Red is the colour of the Lords, green is the colour of the Commons. So if you look, whenever you have the opportunity, you'll notice that Westminster Bridge is painted green, Lambeth Bridge over here is painted red. Here is Westminster Hall leading into St. Stephen's Chapel. Big Ben at this end, what's called Victoria Tower, and the Sovereign's entrance. This is where the Queen comes in for the state opening of Parliament through this entrance here. The Abbey here, we'll do a flyover of that later. The Chamber of the Lords over here, the Chamber of the Commons on that side. So British government represented within this space. It is falling apart. The restoration of Big Ben has been going on for the last 3 years. There is a plan to restore the whole of Parliament. It is decaying. It is it's full of asbestos. The roof leaks. There are something like 10 fires a week somewhere on the parliamentary estate. So the wiring is shot to pieces. It is full of rodents. Insert own joke here. Full of moths. The heating doesn't work very well. The plan is for a 10-year restoration, multi-billion-pound restoration. The House of Lords will move over here to the QE2 Conference Centre. The House of Commons will move into a space built over here within what was the Department of Health, just off Whitehall, Richmond House. And that is going to take place during the next decade. And I forget the estimate, whether it's 2 billion or 3 billion pounds to redo the whole place. We all know that it will exceed that by the time it's finished, and it'll take longer than 10 years to be done. There's a strong case to be made for flattening the whole thing and building something completely new, but historically we would never get away with that. The building itself, even though it looks wonderful, it looks old, it looks Gothic, is actually relatively new. It dates from the 1850s because in 1834, the old Palace of Westminster burnt to the ground. We think politicians are unpopular now, but the night of the fire, crowds gathered to cheer as the place burnt down. It was caused by someone. They used to measure the accounts, the money coming into government through things called tally sticks, little wooden sticks that you put marks on. There was a whole stack of these, and they weren't being used anymore. So they started burning them, and someone thought it would be a good idea to load the furnace up with as many as you could cram in there as possible. The whole Palace of Westminster went up. They saved Westminster Hall, fortunately. This is the back of Westminster Abbey, and this is the back of St. Margaret's Church. So we're looking down towards Parliament Square at that end. The place burnt down. There was a competition. Architects were asked to submit their plans to build a new Palace of Westminster. The fashion at the time was to build things medieval. So the competition stipulated it either had to be done in a Gothic style or a Tudor style. And the winner of it was the gentleman I mentioned earlier, someone called Charles Barry. And he submitted a plan for a Gothic rebuilding. The Victorians, the 19th century middle and upper classes loved medieval architecture and thought they could do a job much better than the actual medieval architects. So the plan was for this new medieval palace to be built. Barry worked with a young architect, a Gothic revivalist, a Catholic called Augustus Pugin, who also did Southwark Cathedral and many other churches. And it's Pugin we owe the decoration, the detail, the fussiness of the whole building. If you go inside, you can have tours, not at the moment, obviously, but there are tours and audio tours that you can have. I always liken it to having a box of chocolates, not in the Forrest Gump sense, but in the sense of a few of them are nice, you eat the whole box, you feel a little bit nauseous. And that's what the decoration's like for me inside the Palace of Westminster. It is so over the top. It is so lush. It is so elaborate. And it covers the whole space. And Pugin was responsible for all of it. He literally worked himself mad by doing it. One of the last things he did in early 1852 was the design for the clock tower. He submitted this. He came up to London from his home in Kent with his son on the train, arrived at Charing Cross, and he'd had a complete mental collapse. Didn't recognize his son, couldn't speak. He was hospitalized. He was then allowed home and he died 6 months later. He was only 40. So the amount of work that he put into doing this literally killed him. And it's this that has survived over the last 150 years. Finished 1859 was when Big Ben rang for the first time, and that's sort of classed as the time the place was finished. If we have a quick peek inside the two chambers, we have got the House of Commons in green that I mentioned before. This as well isn't original. This isn't even original for the Barry design, because in April 1941, a bomb came through the roof, courtesy of the Luftwaffe, and destroyed most of the chamber. So it had to be rebuilt after the war. It was rebuilt in the same way, in the same confrontational style. The government sits on these benches, the opposition sits on these benches, facing each other. The red line there, there's one on this side as well, demarcates the spaces between them. The story is that the space between the two red lines is 2 sword widths. So MPs could not threaten each other with their swords. Probably an apocryphal story, but if the legend becomes a fact, print the legend. This is where the Speaker sits, the Speaker of the House of Commons. His job is, and it's currently a he, but there have been women speakers as well, and there's a woman deputy speaker, is to moderate the debates and also to represent the House. There are 650 MPs in all. The Speaker is elected from the members of Parliament, so is an MP. And tradition has it that the Speaker is reluctant to take the seat and has to be dragged to take the seat after the election. And this again goes back to the early parts of Parliament, when it was the Speaker who had to represent the views of the Parliament to the monarch and had to speak on behalf of the House. And that might not be something that the monarch wanted to hear. It also goes back to King Charles I, who in the early parts, just before the Civil War started, came into the chamber with a party of soldiers to arrest some of the members of Parliament. They'd left, they'd been tipped off, they'd escaped. I see the birds have flown, said Charles, and demanded of the Speaker where they'd gone to. And the Speaker, Lentil, said, "I've neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak, but as the House is pleased to direct me." So establishing a principle with quite a bit of sort of brass neck in front of the king and a bunch of armed soldiers that of the independence of the House. And since the English Civil War, the reigning monarch cannot come into the chamber. So Queen Elizabeth cannot enter the chamber of the House of Commons. When a debate is on the mace, sits here on the table near the clerks, and represents royal power in Parliament, but the monarch cannot come in. The monarch can enter the House of Lords. This is a House of Lords, much more sumptuous, lots of gold, lots of red leather, lots more decoration. The Speaker of the Lords sits in the middle here on a thing called the woolsack. But the Queen, or the reigning monarch, can come into the Lords, and this is where each year he does the speech, the Queen's speech, as it has been for the last 67 years, the King's speech when it is a king. That is a speech written by the Prime Minister, the government, saying the government's programme for the year. And here are a couple of photos. On the right, the Queen in the imperial state crown, with Prince Philip beside her. The Queen rides in her gold carriage to Parliament, robes up. The crown travels in its own carriage to Parliament. Puts the crown on, sits there and reads the speech. The one on the left, she's got Charles next to her, and she's in her mufti, and that's because this was a year where the Queen's speech was organised in a hurry and coincided with the first day of Ascot, and the Queen really wanted to be at Ascot, so she came along, read the speech, got through it as quickly as she could, was then in a fast car over to the racecourse in time for the first race. But you can see it's a wonderful event. When this takes place, the night before, beefeaters search the cellars of the Palace of Westminster, because in 1604, Guy Fawkes tried, 1605, Guy Fawkes tried to blow it up. He was found underneath in the basement with barrels of gunpowder. So ever since then, there is a symbolic search of the cellars by the beefeaters. The Queen can't go into the Commons, so Black Rod, the gentleman usher of the Black Rod, who's a woman at the moment, summons Parliament. She walks out of the Lords, across the central lobby. The door of the Commons chamber is closed in her face as she arrives. She bangs on the door. It's opened, and she says, "Your Majesty, Her Majesty requests your attendance at the other place." And the members of the Commons file out to the bar of the Lords to hear the speech. Another little tradition is that a member of the government has to be in Buckingham Palace as a hostage for the return of the monarch. So while the Queen is in the parliamentary estate, there is a junior minister sat in Buckingham Palace with tea and biscuits, waiting for the Queen to return. I don't know what they do if you know, heaven forbid, the monarch had a heart attack while she was in the palace, whether the hostage would then be taken out and beheaded on the drive of Buckingham Palace. Maybe we'll get that in the future. But a thing sort of wrapped up with all these various traditions, and the effective and the decorative elements of the British Constitution coming together in one meeting once a year, usually in May these days. So moving around the square a bit, we have St. Margaret's Church. This is the parish church of the House of Commons. The first one was built in the 12th century by the monks, the Benedictine monks who occupied the abbey. They didn't want the hoi polloi basically coming into their lovely abbey for everyday services, so they built them a church outside. It was rebuilt about 1500 by Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII, or on his instructions. The photo is from the early 1900s and shows the square a bit differently. There's really quite a nice garden in it. The roads look wider, although there are signs of the horse-drawn traffic all around it. And it looks a darn sight more pleasant than it probably does today, where it's normally a traffic island. This is part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site that is Parliament Square, that involves the Abbey, St Margaret's Church, and the Palace of Westminster. It has a history all of its own. Samuel Pepys, a famous diarist, was married there, as was John Milton, the poet. Walter Raleigh is buried there, executed just outside in the reign of James I. William Caxton is buried somewhere in the grounds, the father of printing in the UK. Harold Macmillan was also married there, as was Winston Churchill back in 1904. Winston and Clementine Churchill were married here. 1904, 1906. I'll come back to you on that. 1904 is wrong. Might have been 1906, might have been 1908, but he was married here anyway. So Churchill and Clementine were married here, and it is open to the public as well. You don't have to have a ticket to go into the Abbey, to go in to have a look at the church, and it's a lovely church on the inside, a lovely medieval shape to it. Just over to the right, we have another building, which is these days the home of our Supreme Court. It's started off as the Middlesex Guildhall, so the town hall for the county of Middlesex. Being the Supreme Court, so our highest judiciary body since 2009. We used to call them the Law Lords. They used to sit in session in Parliament. They got their own building here in 2009. 12 justices of the Supreme Court. Little different to the American Supreme Court in that there is statutory retirement at the age of 70. They're not political appointees. They're appointed by an independent committee of the judiciary, and they don't arbitrate on the Constitution. And they can give judicial review of laws, and often cases come to the Supreme Court if there's some ambiguity in them, for the Lords to decide what the law is meant to say, but Parliament can overrule them if they pass a new law to do it. So the Supreme Court meets here most of the time, and again, it is public. You can go in and watch them in session. And then next to it, not really on Parliament Square, but we can't really cover this without doing Westminster Abbey, the National Church, where coronations, every coronation since 1066 at least, has taken place in Westminster Abbey, where royal funerals take place. It's also the National Mausoleum, in effect. There are over 3,000 burial monuments or graves within the Abbey to most of the famous people in British history. It's actually these days not an abbey. It's not been an abbey since Henry VIII and the Reformation back in the 1430s. Its proper name is the Church of St. Peter at Westminster, and is known as a royal peculiar. It's not within the diocese of the Bishop of London. It answers directly to the monarch. So the monarch appoints the Dean of Westminster, who is in charge of the area. What we see here was built in the 1200s. The first abbey was built for Benedictine monks by Edward the Confessor in 1065. We'll come to that in a second. Let's do another one of those little apple flyovers of it, so you can see it here in situ. The two towers here, added in the 1740s by an architect called Nicholas Hawksmoor, a pupil of Christopher Wren. Wren's plan was to build a bigger tower here in the center, but he realized that the building wasn't structurally strong enough to do it, so that went into abeyance, and these towers were added at the end. This is the chapter house, where the monks used to meet each morning and read a chapter from the book of St. Benedict. This is the Henry VII chapel, where Henry VII is buried. It's built about 1500, St. Margaret's Church next to it. You might also see these coming down. These are the flying buttresses. So the church was built in the 1200s by Henry III, and He borrowed a French architectural style, the new Gothic style, which had flying buttresses, which take the weight of the roof down into the ground, away from the walls. So you can build taller, you can have more glass, you can make the walls thinner. It gives this sense of light and air and height on the inside. Cloisters just here, which are all part of the old monastical setup of it. And over here, Westminster School, an independent school, a private school, a public school, as we call them in England. About £40,000 a year if you want to send one of your offspring to there. John Gielgud went to Westminster. Helena Bonham Carter was in the sixth form. Nick Clegg, another Westminster pupil. Shane McGowan of the Pogues as well, a little bit more obscure for you there, but was also there. This is the first image we have of Westminster Abbey. So it was originally built by Edward the Confessor, one of the last Anglo-Saxon kings. He was a very devout man. He built this abbey for the worship of St. Peter. It was built on what's called a Romanesque style, so smaller, squatter than the current one. Finished-ish early 1066, and almost the first thing to happen was Edward dies and his funeral takes place. So this is from the Bayeux Tapestry. This is from William the Conqueror's record of the conquest of England, and this is some of the preparatory work before the invasion. They are just finishing the abbey here. You can see a workman climbing up some sort of crane device to put a weather vane on. The hand of God is pointing down. The body of Edward is being carried in. I don't know much Latin, but I know I can pick out, here is carried the body of Edward, king, to the church of St. Peter the Apostle. So the first event that takes place there is the funeral of Edward the Confessor. It's thought that King Harold may have been crowned here. So Harold, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings, the one defeated by William at the Battle of Hastings. We do know that William had himself crowned here, Christmas Day 1066, establishing this principle that this was the royal church and the place for coronations. While he was being crowned, the crowd within the church shouted in acclamation. Some of William's knights outside thought that this was the Saxons rising in rebellion and started laying into the crowd with their weapons. So people outside were killed as the coronation was going on because of the noise being generated on the inside. Edward was made a saint about 100 years later. In the 1170s, he was made a saint. So this is Edward the Confessor as a saint. This is Henry III. Now, Henry III was a great worshipper of the cult of Edward the Confessor, of Saint Edward. He called his first son Edward. That's Edward I. Longshanks was Henry III's son. And Henry decided to rebuild the abbey in this new Gothic style, to have a proper shrine for St. Edward, for it to be the proper theatre of the coronation, and to be a royal mausoleum. So he could be buried there and his family could be buried there. It comes to an end as an abbey when we get to Henry VIII on the right. And what we can do here is have a look inside the abbey. This is the shrine of St. Edward. This door here, we'll see in a moment, leads out to the altar. So this is the back of the high altar. This is the shrine of St. Edward. In medieval times, it was a place of pilgrimage. People would come to worship, to get the blessing of the saint. When Henry dissolved this as an abbey, Edward was taken away and buried somewhere else within the church. When his daughter Mary became queen, she made it back into an abbey again, and body, poor old Edward, dug up again, put back into the shrine. When Mary died, she again got rid of it. She was replaced by Elizabeth I. She again got rid of it as an abbey. It was briefly a cathedral, and then it became a church, but the shrine stayed. So the shrine is the holiest spot within the abbey. Kings are buried around it. That's Henry III over here. You've got Henry V buried on this side. Richard II over here somewhere, and I forget which king that is. But you have got some of the medieval kings buried around the side of it. And if we look at the work that Henry III did, he's the one who gave us this wonderful nave. Here we are. This is where the coronation happens. In front of the high altar, the pavement here is called the Cosmati pavement, built by Italian mosaicists, and the high altar at the back, the door leading through into the shrine. The high altar is Victorian. It was replaced in the 1800s, but the Cosmati pavement dates from the 1200s. We can look up, see the different levels around the church. Poets' Corner off around that way, the west door there, the choir here. If you've ever been, or if you've ever seen any services such as the royal wedding or Diana's funeral, this is the door through which people come to the center of the church. This is the normal public door on the north side that people see. One more final image. We'll go to Henry VIII. One of the reasons why you know that abbeys in the north of England, in Wales, were left derelict. They were stripped bare, the roofs taken out, left to ruins. Westminster Abbey didn't suffer that fate. It lost its treasures, it lost its money, it lost its land. That all went to the king, it all went to friends of the king. But the abbey itself stayed as a religious space, mainly because it was the burial ground of kings, and Henry believed in the rightness, the divine right of kings, and therefore that they should not be disturbed or desecrated. Also, perhaps more significantly, his father, Henry VII, had built a chapel at the end of the abbey and is buried within that chapel. So this is the Henry VII chapel. It's the bit that tucks on the end closest to Parliament. Henry VII is buried here with his wife, Elizabeth of York. They are behind a bronze screen within there. The chapel is the chapel of the Order of the Bath. So all these wooden stalls are where the Knights of the Order of the Bath sit. They have their coat of arms flying above them, their helm, their crest and their helm, and coats of arms in brass on their particular stalls. Queen sits over here, and Prince Charles sits over here. That's looking down into the shrine. The Henry VII chapel, or the Lady Chapel, because it's dedicated to the Virgin Mary, is an absolutely sumptuous bit of work, built about 1500. At that time, the rest of Europe is going through the Renaissance. They're building classical buildings. In England, always slightly detached from Europe, we have got the last flourishings of the Gothic. And this is in a style called Perpendicular Gothic. And if we pan up and look at the ceiling here, you can see a perfect evocation of that. This wonderful, incredibly ornate and decorative stonework. These sort of dewdrops, these pendulums coming down, they're the size of oil drums. They hold the ceiling in together. And it is an absolutely stunning piece of work. It's a type of architecture unique to England. You can see it also in King's College Chapel in Cambridge, in Canterbury Cathedral, and one or two other places, including the church in Putney has got a small perpendicular Gothic chapel within that. So it's a wonderful decorative. The windows dedicated to the Virgin Mary. You've got the RAF Battle of Britain chapel at that end, because in 1940 a bomb landed between the Abbey and Parliament, blew out all of the windows, and those were redone in the early 21st century, and dedicated to the Battle of Britain here and the Virgin Mary up at the top. So one, I think, final bit, the statues in Parliament Square. There are a dozen of them, a good clutch of Victorian and 19th century prime ministers. They've got Disraeli there, Canning, who no one's ever heard of, the Earl of Derby, who even fewer people have heard of, Robert Peel, who started the Metropolitan Police. In the background, behind Gandhi, is a statue of Abraham Lincoln. The corner closest to Big Ben, you've got the statue of Churchill, parliamentarian for over 60 years. This was unveiled by Clementine in 1973. Is the focus for whenever there's a protest in Parliament Square these days. Someone sticks a flag on it, or puts a bit of turf on Churchill's head, or paints on the plinth underneath. We also have others now. There's Jan Smuts, the Prime Minister of South Africa, the only person to sign both the treaties ending the First World War and the Second World War. Nelson Mandela, at the corner, you can see the Supreme Court behind him. A statue of Gandhi that was unveiled by David Cameron with the state visit of the Indian Prime Minister. I've included this one of Lloyd George, which stands next to Churchill. Lloyd George was the Liberal Prime Minister, or the Coalition Prime Minister, in the First World War, 1916 through to 1922. He and Churchill, great rivals, very similar in some ways. I've included it because I think it's one of the worst statues in the whole of London, and there's a lot of competition for that. But it looks as if it's been done by Dick Bruner, who does Miffy. So if you go to Parliament Square, I urge you to go and revel in it. And the most recent one to be added in 2018, the only woman statue in the square, the only one done by a woman, by an artist called Gillian Waring. And it is Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who was the president of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Very, very active, very prominent in getting women the vote in the early 20th century. So erected in 2018 for the 100th anniversary of women being eligible to vote. It wasn't a full franchise for women, but the first broadening of the franchise to allow women. She was a suffragist rather than a suffragette, in that she believed in peaceful protest in order to get the vote. The suffragettes were the ones who said deeds, not words. They were the ones who did direct action, chaining themselves to Buckingham Palace, putting a bomb under the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey, splashing paintings in the National Gallery. Fawcett was the pacifist wing, if you like, of that, but incredibly deserving of a statue. I've forgotten who it is, but there is another statue being planned, another woman statue being planned. So at this rate, it'll only be 2.5 centuries before there are the same number of women as there are men being represented in Parliament Square. So that's our whistle-stop tour. I've probably gone on far too much. It's meant to be 30 minutes. Our tour is meant to be 30 minutes. As I say, these are the evening ones that we've got coming up. But these lunchtime lights are meant to be shorter ones than that. So my apologies as ever, talking too much. I will pick it up. If you've got any questions, let me just stop sharing the screen. If you've got any questions, put them into chat. It's a bit difficult to get people to speak. So let me just turn the chat on. So if you do have any questions, just type something into chat. We'll see that at the bottom of your screen there, and I will do my best to answer them. I shall have a sip of water while you're thinking of any questions. So coming up tomorrow, one of our lunchtime lights is Rachel doing a short history of tea drinking. Wednesday, I'm going to show you 5 objects from the British Museum. The Rosetta Stone being one of them, the Easter Island or the Rapa Nui statue being another, the Lewis chessmen as well. On Thursday, Tim is going to talk about Shakespeare's Globe. They're on the South Bank, both its history and its present. And next Tuesday, Rachel is going to be doing Bath, and next Thursday, Tim is going to be doing a virtual rock and roll stroll around Soho. He does a much bigger rock and roll stroll around London, Soho, Beatles, Rolling Stones, David Bowie, Elton John, lots of good sites there. So there's a lot of stuff there coming up. So if you go to uktoursonline.com, either follow the sites to our forthcoming tours or to our lunchtime lights, and you'll see a full list, and you can book for them there. Oh, I've exhausted you all. Any questions? I don't think there are. Give it another. Thank you for your compliments anyway, but if you've got a question, now's the time to answer it. Ask it even. Right, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Whistle stop, speed, lots of stuff. I've talked too long. The next one I do will be 30 minutes. So we'll try and keep it to that. I hope we'll see you at some more over the next couple of weeks. If they go well, we'll add more in. We put 8 in at the moment, but if they look to be popular, we'll add more in through December, and then when we start up again in January. Someone asking whether I have a tour of the Bayeux Tapestry. Unfortunately not. I do have. It would be good. I do have my copy of the Bayeux Tapestry here from when I went to Bayeux. I could sit here one day, sort of just opening it out, couldn't I? Panel by panel, but it's a wonderful wonderful thing. But I'm afraid that the Guild of French Guides would be on my case if I started doing a tour of Bayeux. I think I would get some strong missives in French from our Gallic colleagues if I start treading on their patch. Right, time for lunch. Thank you all very much. Hopefully see some of you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye. Oh, sorry, one quick question. Last minute question. Does robbing Peter to pay Paul have any relation to the Abbey? There is a legend that is the case, that when the Abbey became a cathedral, fell under the control of the Bishop of Durham, Bishop of London. He favoured St. Paul's in the city over St. Peter's in Westminster, and he took money from St. Peter's to help restore St. Paul's. So how true it is, we don't know, but it's another one of these great stories that robbing Peter, robbing the Abbey to pay Paul to fund the restoration of St. Paul's Cathedral. That's where that phrase comes from. Who knows? It's a good story, so it's worth repeating. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.